September 29, 1833. Inside the majestic halls of the royal palace of Madrid, a once mighty monarch lies rotting in his own bed, alone, diseased, and abandoned. His cries echo down the marble corridors, but no one rushes to his side. Ferdinand VII, once King of Spain, is dying not from war or betrayal, but from the festering consequences of his own depravity. Ravaged by syphilis, this self-proclaimed defender of Catholic virtue spent a lifetime disgracing the very throne he swore to uphold. To understand how a crown became a curse, and how a nation fell under the weight of one man's insatiable cruelty, we must journey into the darkest corners of royal power, where corruption, lust, and blood define the legacy of Spain's most perverted king. October 14, 1784. Madrid. In the sprawling, candlelit corridors of the Spanish royal palace, the birth of a prince was celebrated with grand ceremony. Ferdinand, son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, was received as the future of a proud empire. But behind the pomp and golden silk, shadows loomed. The palace walls had long soaked in whispers of betrayal, scandal, and secrets, seeds that would take root in the young heir's soul. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, carried a reputation that no veil could conceal. Known for her many lovers, the most infamous being Manuel Godoy, she ruled her chambers not with virtue, but with seduction. Godoy, the Prince of Peace, held more sway over the court than the king himself, and young Ferdinand grew up watching his father shrink under his mother's dominance. From his earliest years, Ferdinand's nature troubled even the most seasoned courtiers. At the tender age of 10, he displayed a fascination with pain, not his own, but that of others. Servants whispered stories of cats hung by their tails, of birds mutilated for entertainment, of footmen whipped for minor mistakes. No punishment seemed too cruel, no game too dark. Tutors tried in vain to curb his tendencies. Those who dared confront him were soon dismissed. Others chose silence over their own ruin. While other European princes were immersed in lessons of diplomacy, languages, and the arts, Ferdinand cared only for pleasure. Books collected dust on his shelves. Music bored him. Statecraft irritated him. But there was one activity that thrilled him: voyeurism. He had spy holes carved discreetly into the walls of the palace, enabling him to observe the private affairs of ladies-in-waiting and courtiers alike. He watched, silently feeding the darkness that grew unchecked inside him. At 18, a marriage was arranged. Maria Antonia of Naples, his cousin, was sent to Madrid with hopes of reforming the prince. She was a cultured and devout young woman, unprepared for the man who awaited her. On their wedding night, her horror began. Behind the gilded doors of their bedchamber, Ferdinand's appetite revealed itself, not for intimacy, but for domination. Court officials, bound by duty, recorded what they could not say aloud: the queen's rapid decline, her pallor, her isolation. Maria Antonia became a ghost within the palace, living in secluded quarters, avoiding her husband's approach like one avoids plague. When she dared resist, he grew inventive, using his title and power to force her compliance through threats and humiliation. But she was only the beginning. Soon, Ferdinand turned his eyes toward the women of the court. With the Inquisition's shadow ever looming, threats of heresy and scandal became his weapons. Maids, married noblewomen, even the wives of his ministers, none were safe. Refusal could mean ruin. A misplaced rumor, a letter forged, a secret revealed. These were the tools of his seduction. For Ferdinand, the act itself was secondary. What truly thrilled him was the conquest, the degradation of women whose husbands bowed before him in daylight, while their dignity was stripped away at night. The court became complicit. Ministers who objected disappeared. Those who played along were rewarded. The palace turned into a hunting ground, its corridors echoing with secrets and sobs behind velvet drapes. When Maria Antonia died at just 21, the official cause was tuberculosis, but many believed otherwise. Her confessor spoke later of a woman spiritually broken, pleading for death as her only escape. Ferdinand's reaction was chilling. No mourning, no memorial. Now I'm free," he reportedly quipped, moving quickly to resume his twisted pleasures with renewed freedom. The court, though murmuring behind fans and curtains, dared not confront him. He was the heir apparent, and Spain was drifting into chaos. Then came Napoleon. In 1808, the French swept into Spain under the pretext of alliance, but with conquest in mind. The country burned, cities fell, and the people called for unity. But Ferdinand, ever calculating, saw opportunity. During the uprising at Aranjuez, Charles IV abdicated under pressure, and Ferdinand claimed the throne. Yet instead of leading the fight against the invaders, he secretly reached out to Napoleon, offering his loyalty in exchange for security. When summoned to Bayonne, he bowed before the French emperor like a beggar, pleading not for his country, but for his own power. Witnesses present at Bayonne were appalled. Here stood the supposed king of Spain, groveling before a foreign emperor, offering bribes, concessions, anything to be left with a crown. Napoleon, master manipulator though he was, found the scene almost pathetic. "Never have I known a man so base," he later remarked. Ferdinand was sent into exile at the Château de Valençay, where he was to remain while Spain bled. But exile to Ferdinand was no punishment. It was paradise. In France, he resumed his debauchery without pretense. Servants, prostitutes, even exiled Spanish nobles' daughters, none escaped his attention. French spies intercepted letters in which he requested a rotating supply of female entertainment, detailing his preferences with disturbing specificity. While guerrilla fighters and patriots died by the thousands to resist French occupation, their so-called monarch feasted, fornicated, and laughed. His first bout with venereal disease was contracted during these years, perhaps the beginning of the agony that would claim him decades later. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, hailed briefly as a savior, the people soon learned the bitter truth. The nation had suffered for 6 long years, and now their reward was a king more tyrant than liberator. One of his first acts was to restore the Inquisition, not for faith, but for fear. Through it, he could silence dissent, destroy enemies, and above all, control women. Confessions were extracted with threats of torture. Heresy could be forgiven, for a price. Often, that price was the body of a daughter, a wife, a sister. 2 years later, he married again. Isabella of Braganza, a young Portuguese princess, was little more than a political offering, handed to him like a prize pig in a velvet box. Ferdinand, now in his 30s and emboldened by unchecked power, saw her not as a partner, but as a plaything. Whatever cruelty Maria Antonia endured, Isabella faced double. Behind palace doors, she was bruised, battered, broken. Some servants reported hearing screams late into the night, followed by silence that felt even more terrifying. Her death came swiftly, in 1818. Officially, it was illness. Unofficially, it was murder by matrimony. The whispers of bruises, of torn garments, of whispered prayers from behind locked doors. None made it into the court record, but they lingered in the memories of those who survived her. Ferdinand, unmoved, married again within months. The new queen, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, was only 20 years old. Her fate would mirror the others: submission, suffering, and a suspiciously early death. He didn't even wait for the country to stabilize. The empire crumbled around him. The colonies in the Americas, once jewels of the Spanish crown, declared independence one by one, but Ferdinand had no time for statecraft. He was too busy pursuing virgins, including cloistered nuns he coerced with threats of damnation or destruction. Families, desperate for survival, sold their daughters to him. It was a transaction in blood and shame. By the time he reached his 40s, Ferdinand was no longer a man, but a rotting monument to cruelty. His body bloated, his face disfigured by disease. He wandered his palace with glazed eyes and foul breath, attended by doctors more afraid than loyal. The man who had crushed dissent, raped the dignity of his court, and plunged Spain into ruin, was now drowning in his own decay. But his story was far from over. The worst was yet to come. In the waning years of the 1820s, the world had changed, but Ferdinand had not. Spain's place in the world had crumbled. The once vast empire, a tapestry of colonies stitched across oceans, had unraveled thread by thread. Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, all had declared independence, and the royal banners of Spain were trampled underfoot in cities once ruled by conquistadors. Yet in the palace at Madrid, Ferdinand remained cocooned in delusion, still drunk on the fumes of absolute power, still guided by desire rather than duty. The court, once bustling with diplomats and ministers, had transformed into a theater of lust and spectacle. His appetite for cruelty and control was now so deeply ingrained that even those closest to him moved with caution, as if afraid that a single misstep would summon the king's wrath, or worse, his attention. His final marriage in 1829 to Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies was not made from love or even diplomacy. It was desperation. Ferdinand, bloated, riddled with disease, and sliding into madness, needed an heir. His previous wives had either died mysteriously or failed to produce one. Maria Cristina was only 23, young, reserved, and thoroughly aware of what fate awaited her. But she was also pragmatic. Her family had coached her well. Submit, survive, bear a child, and perhaps, just perhaps, outlive the monster. By now, Ferdinand's body was failing. The syphilis he had contracted years earlier from one of many prostitutes had progressed beyond redemption. Ulcers festered on his limbs, his joints swelled, and his mind began to fracture. He suffered hallucinations, bouts of wild paranoia, and violent mood swings. Courtiers recounted moments when he would scream at walls, accuse paintings of conspiracy, or weep uncontrollably in his bath. But what made him most dangerous was that his authority remained unchecked. No one dared remove him. Even Maria Cristina, who tried to maintain a semblance of composure and protect the crown's dignity, quickly learned that beneath his decaying skin still lived a man who demanded obedience and feared irrelevance. Ferdinand's routines became grotesque. Each day he surrounded himself with women, not for companionship but for domination. The palace retained a hidden wing known only to a few, the so-called inner circle, a twisted harem of mistresses, many of whom had arrived under duress. Some were the daughters of desperate nobles hoping to gain favor. Others had been forced from convents or coerced with threats of ruin. Their role was not love, nor even lust, it was subjugation. Ferdinand's pleasures had grown darker with time. Court records unearthed long after his death described a man obsessed with humiliation, staging scenes where women were stripped, mocked, and forced into cruel rituals for his amusement. There were no boundaries anymore. There was only his will, and the silence of those too terrified to stop him. But even his perversions couldn't mask the stench of decay. By 1830, Ferdinand's body was a battlefield of disease. Doctors, summoned from across Europe, offered salves, tinctures, and prayers, but none could undo what he had invited upon himself. The syphilis had reached his brain. At times, he could no longer recognize those around him. He spoke to people long dead. He ordered executions for imaginary crimes. His once commanding presence now frightened even his most loyal allies. The king, once feared, was now pitted, gawked at, and avoided. The palace became quieter. Footsteps echoed hollow in empty corridors. Servants did their duties with eyes lowered, hoping not to be noticed. Ministers postponed meetings, afraid to be summoned into his presence. The power that had once corrupted him had now become a cage from which he could not escape. Maria Cristina, perhaps the only person left who dared act, moved cautiously. She secured the support of reformist nobles, contacted foreign allies, and ensured that when the inevitable end came, there would be a path forward for the crown. She gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, Ferdinand's only legitimate child. In that child lay the future, a fragile hope born from decades of ruin. Ferdinand, despite his failing mind, understood one thing: a girl could not rule in Spain without conflict. He tried, in one of his last coherent acts, to rewrite succession laws to favor his daughter, a decision that would plunge the country into future civil war. But for now, it was survival. As 1833 dawned, the king's condition deteriorated further. His flesh was riddled with open sores, his breath a toxic fog. He spent most of his days in bed, sweating, moaning, and occasionally screaming in confusion. The smell of death hung in the air, unmistakable and cruel. No incense could mask it. Physicians now visited in shifts, not to heal, but to monitor the descent. They applied leeches, drained fluids, and rubbed ointments into blistered skin, but none of it helped. The disease had spread to his spine. He could no longer stand. He sold himself. At night, he wept and begged for relief. There were no more mistresses, no more orgies, no more fawning nobles. Only shadows, silence, and the slow unraveling of a man who had once made the entire court tremble. In the final week of September, as the bells of Madrid tolled for the feast of St. Michael, Ferdinand lay on silk sheets, muttering nonsense. His skin had turned pale green, and his eyes no longer focused. Maria Cristina stayed by his side, not out of love, but duty, perhaps also out of fear. She knew that once the king died, the real danger would begin. But as he gasped and struggled, even she kept a handkerchief over her face, unable to bear the smell. Courtiers avoided the room. The marble halls that once echoed with laughter and commands were now still. Even his most devoted servants found reasons to be elsewhere. The man who had turned his kingdom into a nightmare, who had preyed on the weak, corrupted the pious, and betrayed his own blood, was alone. On the morning of September 29, 1833, the silence broke with a single whisper from the royal physician. He's gone. No cannon fired. No cities mourned. The body was prepared quickly, not with reverence, but with haste. His face was covered immediately. There would be no open casket. The chapel was sparsely attended. Most of Madrid remained indifferent. For many, his death was not a tragedy, but a deliverance. Behind closed doors, nobles sighed with relief. Mothers wept, not for his passing, but for the daughters who had suffered under his reign. Priests offered blessings, but some could barely finish their prayers. Ferdinand VII had ruled Spain for nearly 2 decades. In that time, he had transformed a mighty empire into a fractured, humiliated shell. His legacy was not one of glory, but of horror. The crown passed to his daughter, Isabella II, a child who would inherit a country on the edge of war, a kingdom poisoned by her father's sins. She would be queen, but always under the shadow of the man who made Spain a nation of whispers and wounds. History would remember Ferdinand not as a monarch, not even as a tyrant, but as a predator who wore the crown like a disguise. His reign stood as a brutal reminder of what happens when absolute power meets absolute depravity. His victims had no voices then, but the scars remained, on the people, on the nation, and on the blood-soaked pages of Spain's royal legacy. The palace survived him. The throne endured. But the man who once ruled from it died as he lived, diseased, dishonored, and despised.